The 2018 Summer Institute in Migration Research Methods provided 8 days of training in the use and analysis of migration data at UC Berkeley, targeting early career scholars. The Institute drew local and national experts to train attendees and provide on-site mentorship. Most participant costs were covered thanks to an award from the Russell Sage Foundation and the Carnegie Corporation of New York.
Many of the key policy questions from a demographic perspective and often a sociological or a policy perspective have to do with very basic descriptive questions about the undocumented population or the immigrant population broken down into different statuses. And so at the heart, a lot of the stuff that we're interested in is descriptive in its core. It's not necessarily causal. We're not trying to make causal arguments. We can talk a little bit more about that later. But what we're really trying to do is get a very simple, what are the characteristics? What is the size of the undocumented population? What are its rates of growth? Is it increasing? Is it plateauing? Is it declining? So that's sort of like that first question. Very descriptive. I call that sort of the outline of the population. It's like if you can imagine what that outline looks like. And then inside of the population is the characteristics. So what is it made of? And so here we're just trying to look at basic stuff: family, household structure, health coverage, poverty levels, duration of residence, language proficiencies, and you might think, what does that get me? Well, it gets us a lot because a lot of policy decisions are based on these very basic descriptions of populations, and when you don't have the legal status variables in the first place, this is a harder thing to get at than you might think at first. So, and then there's the SIP, which is a national sample. So of all of these samples, it's the only nationally representative sample of the U.S. population that does have a question on it has two questions on legal status. The first is, what was the status that you had when you first arrived in the United States? And I think it's the categories are things like green card, some kind of visa, like a student visa, or came as a refugee, and then some other status. And the other is unspecified, but we kind of make this assumption that most of them are undocumented. And then it asks later, did you adjust your status? So those two questions together can help you understand sort of what the current status is of the immigrants in the SIP. A lot of the times when we see analyses of the undocumented population and their characteristics being published, they have been based on these big surveys like the ACS and CPS, and innovative imputation methods have grown out of the need for that information more than anything else, I would say. How many undocumented immigrants in the country? 11 million. So how do you know that? Yeah, so this is the residual method. And so what it is, it's been used since the 70s to estimate the size and growth of this population. And it's a demographic accounting method for doing so. And so it's a combination of both census data and administrative records of the number of people who come with documents as a legal immigrant or admitted as a lawful permanent residence. And so the first thing you would do if you were implementing this method is to figure out how many lawfully permanent residents are there living in the country. And this is based on this equation that's right here. So what it is like you would just sum up the number of new arrivals or new admissions. It's not really arrivals because some of them arrived earlier, but the new admissions. And usually you would pick a date, like 1980. And then you would add up all of the admissions since then. And then you would have to adjust it because some of those people died And some of those people, they didn't stay in the United States, and so they emigrated. And so there's a set of assumptions, again, that you would have to apply to those numbers to update those admissions so that you discount all of those exits from the population. And then once you figure that out, you subtract that from the total foreign-born in order to get a total unauthorized population.
Beyond estimating the size of a particular migrant population by legal status, that is, the number of people, we are also interested in immigrants' characteristics. So, social scientists want to know information about different groups of immigrants, such as legal permanent residents, refugees, or undocumented migrants. One way of creating such a profile is through logical imputation. Researchers take a population survey, such as the American Community Survey or the Current Population Survey, and impute legal status. That is, immigrants' legal status is assigned based on characteristics known to correlate with specific sorts of statuses. Those immigrants not assigned to a status through logical imputation are then randomly assigned to the status of LPR, or unauthorized, but this raises a number of questions.
So implicitly, there is quite a bit of measurement error in this method, and there's a lot of, whenever you assign somebody on the basis of random draws, you're essentially saying that those two groups of people are identical to one another. That's what randomization does, you know. And so, you know, I'm not sure if randomization helps us in this case very much, except it just gets the numbers right, you know. So he makes sure that, you know, he's hitting these targets, like the number of undocumented that you should be seeing in the data, and broken down by country of birth and duration of residence and age and sex. And so it kind of just fills in those cells until he hits those targets, and then the rest of them would be legal. So, this method takes a lot of work, a lot of combing through the data, a lot of coding. I'm not saying that our method takes less coding, but I'm not sure that there's as much of an individual discretionary kind of role that the analyst has in the statistical imputation method as it does for this logical method. This is survey-based imputation, and we're not the first ones to think of this. It was actually developed, some of the earliest ones in the late 1980s. David Heer and actually Jeff Cassell worked on that with him, where they had a survey conducted, I think, in Los Angeles, where they actually had legal status of the respondents. And it was just a small survey in housing, I think, or welfare, I'm trying to remember exactly. But, and then they used that to create a prediction model. So they had like age, sex, country of birth, bunch of things, demographic variables, predicting whether or not that person said they were undocumented. And then they used that in the census to then get a probability that that person is undocumented based on that prediction model. And that's similar to what we would call a single equation imputation. Since then, of course, the imputation methods have developed quite a bit. And so we ended up moving to what's called a multiple imputation approach that takes into account uncertainty in the assignments. And so this is the basis of that combined survey or combined sample multiple imputation approach. Typically what we have is two data sets. So we have one data set we're calling the donor data, okay? And the donor data is often a smaller data set. It might be a very specialized data set, but we hope that it's similar to the target data in its universe, the population from which it's sampling. So we have this donor data, and in our case, it's the SIP, okay? It's the best one that we could find. And it will have the variable of interest, whether or not somebody is unauthorized, And then we'll have a set of common variables that we're interested in using in our analysis. You know, you name it. It's usually, for us, it would be demographic variables or some outcome of interest like poverty or education. And then oftentimes there's, and here, these are these other variables: labor force, welfare, health. Now the target data is as identical as possible with respect to the variables and the measures it includes and the universe from which it samples. But the only difference is that it has no information on legal status.
To do combined sample multiple imputation, two fundamental conditions have to be met. First, the samples must be drawn from the same universe. That is, it must be from the same underlying population.
Potential violations using state-level sample, like the California Health Interview Survey, to then, as your donor data, to impute a national sample on legal status. So that could be a problem because legal status in California may be related to your outcomes in a different way than it is for people who live in New York or Texas.
A second fundamental condition that must be met for combined sample multiple imputation is the joint observation condition. Variables used in the imputation and analysis must be observed in both samples. Failing to have jointly observed variables can lead to serious problems.
This is the problem that prevents us from seeing paradoxes in our data. Okay? So imagine this, okay? Imagine you had a data set where you had socioeconomic status, I don't care what measure it is, and health. So you would guess, right, that higher socioeconomic status is related to higher health, or better health. Then let's say you had another data set where you had undocumented status and education. Well, undocumented status is related to lower levels of education. So through the chained link rule, you would conclude that because they were undocumented and they had lower education, that then therefore they must also have lower health. But we also know from data sets where we actually have all three variables that there is actually an immigrant paradox where despite having low levels of education, immigrants actually have better health. So what the hell is that, right? So we wouldn't know that if we were using this method and we didn't have the jointly observed sets of variables. So this is why I keep saying go back to the data, make sure that your donor data has the complete story in it, because otherwise you could be making mistakes. Okay? So I always want this to be grounded empirically, you know. Otherwise we're just making assumptions and we're leaping from one chain link to another without actually knowing that that's true. And sometimes we could be surprised. And I think that's what makes social science interesting, right?
Thank you for watching. Please watch the other videos in the series using the links below.